If you're still playing fantasy football in week 15, it likely means one of three things. First, you made your league's fantasy football playoffs. Congrats! Second, you're trying to avoid winning that last place punishment. Good luck. Or maybe third, you're just a stone cold degenerate, one of us. Either way, we do have 3 more weeks of action to get through, trying to clinch those championships or whatever the heck it is you're into. And accordingly, I have 7 tips today to try to help us accomplish that very task. As always, it's a great day to be great. Tip number 1, start your studs, but they better be studs. Now, what I mean by this, guys, is I see a lot of times the term stud used just far too broadly for our purposes here. So when I say stud, I'm talking about clearly and easily checking at least 3 of the 4 following boxes. Talent. Are you a legit, really good player in real life? Offensive environment. Is this offense always a threat to score 30 plus points during any given week? Volume. Can we look at the utilization and associated workload and conclude that yes, this player is in fact receiving elite opportunity? And finally, last and honestly least, the matchup. How are we expecting this defense to perform against this specific position? And again, I think it's this last variable that gets us in the most trouble sometimes. Matchups are great to analyze, and they should be used as a tiebreaker. Just don't let them get in the way of starting really good players and really good offenses with, wait for it, really good volume associated with it. And hey, if you already knew this, great. Let's move on to tip number 2. Which is focusing on being at least a week ahead of your competition in the streaming QB and DST markets. Now, in terms of the quarterback, guys, I would hope that you don't have to be going into the streaming streets at this point in the season, but as Justin Herbert managers know all too well, injuries can and will happen during the course of any given week of action, so accordingly being ready to pounce on the best available matchup-induced options down the stretch can just help you stay, again, one step ahead of the competition. So the 3 quarterbacks that are available in more leagues than not, who I do believe have a decent chance of booming beyond what our usual expectation is: Will Levis, Russell Wilson, and Derek Carr. Levis is going to get 2 matchups against the pass funnel Texans over these next 3 weeks, sandwiched in between a spot with the Seahawks. Sign me up for that. Derek Carr is going to be going out there, guys, and getting the face off against the Giants, the Rams, and then a juicy week 17 spot against the Buccaneers, while Russell Wilson has really easy matchups there against the Lions and the Chargers in weeks 15 and 17, with a tougher trip against Bill Belichick and company squeezed in between there. So again, these guys aren't going to be exactly ranked in our top 12 or anything. I hope you do have a better QB option out there, but just based on who is usually available and the matchups, I do think Will Levis, Derek Carr, and Russell Wilson present the best bang for your buck on that waiver wire. And then there's the DST spot for those who are interested in that kind of thing. The top 5 defensive special teams that I would be attempting to stream over the course of these next 3 weeks. First up, guys, it got to be the Los Angeles Rams. We're talking about matchups with Washington, New Orleans, and then the Giants to end the season. Still only rostered in 18% of Yahoo leagues. By far my favorite streaming defense for down the stretch. My second favorite DST is going to be the Indianapolis Colts, still only rostered in 42% of fantasy leagues, despite them being a top 5 fantasy scoring DST. Going to get to finish their season off with spots against the Steelers, the Falcons, and the Raiders, a bunch of quarterbacks that we love to see again facing off against our DST during any given week. Additionally, guys, the Texans, the Packers, and yes, even the Falcons present the sort of 3-week schedules in which we should feel better about firing up them over most of the middling tier DSTs, but even guys like the Cowboys and Ravens, who unfortunately have to face one juggernaut offense after another here down the stretch. This takes us to tip number 3. Be aware of Mother Nature, but don't necessarily overly fear her. Famous last words, perhaps, I know, but there is a fantastic article by Fantasy Life chief meteorologist. Okay, he's not really a meteorologist, but he did spend a lot of time studying this stuff. I'm talking about my dude, Chris Allen. Fantastic article on fantasylife.com to help determine if wind really does matter in fantasy football. And I just want to shout out a few of his takeaways from this, again, BEA Beautiful manifesto. Chris's first note, guys, is that only 3.7% of regular season games since 2018 have actually included the 20 miles per hour plus wind speeds that actually concern us as fantasy managers. So really, as much as we do hype up these instances of bad weather, they aren't quite as prevalent as you think. Also not quite as prevalent as you think is the overall impact on the wind in terms of both play calling volume and also passing success. Specifically, we have seen teams in this sample lose use roughly 2 full plays per game, which again does change the projections, but not exactly a ton. And additionally, guys, we see quarterbacks suffer a 1.6% drop in their completion percentage over expected. Not good, but also, again, maybe not worth the weekly freakouts we tend to see during December over in the fantasy football Twitter streets. And yeah, guys, I think these final 2 points are actually the 2 most important ones. First being that Chris says that scrambling actually has really helped enable good quarterbacks to keep on keeping on. 6 of the top 7 fantasy performances, just in terms of raw fantasy points per game, did indeed come from quarterbacks that also had a top 10 scramble rate. Justin Fields, Josh Allen. Makes sense that these types of guys are going to be far more adept at dealing with bad weather than more stationary pocket passers. But finally, guys, Chris's, pretty much conclusion here. In short, good passers stay good, at least for fantasy purposes they did. So, hey, just like a bad matchup, I'm not saying you shouldn't concern yourself with Mother Nature at all. Just don't let it be the one single variable to drop someone completely down the ranks. Takes us to our next tip. When in doubt, follow the utilization. So yeah, I know I've said matchups and Mother Nature, these things can be tiebreakers, but don't get it twisted, guys. If I have a decision that is at all close and the one big varying factor is the utilization, give me the player who's going to be touching the football far more often on Sunday. Lucky for you, you don't have to get in the lab and actually start grinding all these projections. You can just use our handy dandy tools over at Fantasy Life in our utilization hub to manage just that. Whether it's reading Dwayne McFarland's weekly critically acclaimed utilization report, or just looking for yourself at the game by game team logs and seeing who's actually out there on the field, you can find pretty much any utilization data point you want in our utilization hub. But I really think it's our player comparison tool that's going to help you guys the most over these next 3 weeks. And just look at this example with some Baltimore wide receivers, an offense that we've seen have plenty of production in recent weeks, but with Zay Flowers, OBJ, and even Rashad Bateman varying as the guy that seems to be getting the most looks on a weekly basis, it can be tough to consider all these different variables that go into just one volume-based projection. But lucky for you, with this player comparison tool, it does just that. And again, as you guys can see, OBJ is getting the dub here ahead of week 15. Again, not the end all be all. No one single stat is in the lovely game of fantasy football. Still, yeah, give me Devin Achane and Brandon Ayuk if we're going to have a couple fewer opportunities out there compared to someone in a terrible offense. But generally, guys, utilization does tend to be king in fantasy football land. So let's use that as our first and foremost tiebreaker whenever needed. This takes us to tip number 5, guys, which is to dominate your waiver wire, even if it is just to block your opponent. Now, when we do get into the playoff weeks, there's only a few teams still eligible, and accordingly, hopefully no one's being dicks out there. We're only competing against a few teams still very much alive in your playoff race on the waiver wire. But that said, even if you don't need this specific player and you're not going to start them, if you do view them as an advantage to your opponent, well, scoop them the hell up and stash them on your bench. I think the biggest applicable instance of this does come down to the handcuff running back rat race. Ty Chandler and Zamir White were dominating the waiver wire blurbs this week, but guys, we still see Rico Dowdle, Tajay Spears, Jordan Mason, amongst others, still very much out there in more fantasy leagues than not. So really, best advice here is to try to stay away from, again, investing too heavily maybe in these wide receivers or that second quarterback, guys that aren't going to help you anyway and probably aren't going to be starting elsewhere anyway. If at all, guys, focus on these handcuff running backs, because those are the guys where you're looking up in week 16 and week 17 saying, how on earth did I let this now 70% snap rate player slip through my fingertips and get into my opponent's hands? Tip number 6, guys, we need to adjust our expectations just a bit relative to what teams still have to play for. Now, this probably won't be too much of an issue before week 17, maybe week 18 for you DFS degens out there, but just in general, it's being aware of what teams have already clinched the first round bye and could potentially just, again, rest their players down the stretch. Right now, the 49ers and also the Ravens are looking like the 2 most likely squads to achieve that. And on the other side of the spectrum, we do have to consider teams that have already been eliminated. Right now, just the Patriots and Panthers have actively been eliminated from playoff contention, but there are another 8 teams that have under 10% odds of making it per the New York Times, specifically the Jets, Titans, Raiders, Chargers, Giants, Commanders, Cardinals, and Bears join the aforementioned Patriots and Panthers as teams with 10% or under chances of making the playoffs. I'm not saying guys like Ezekiel Elliott and Chuba Hubbard won't continue to rack up fantasy-friendly volume inside of teams with nothing else to play for. That said, just keep it in mind and remember, when guys are banged up or wondering if someone's going to come back at the end of a season, having absolutely nothing to play for would seemingly, at least rationally, lead to situations where we see coaching staffs take it more so easy on these sorts of archetypes. And finally, guys, tip number 7. Talk that smack to your friends after you eliminate them. What's the point of winning fantasy playoff games if you don't let the entire world hear about it? Maybe even direct them to my weekly Sheesh report to remind them of just how close they may have come to capturing that fantasy playoff glory. But everyone, that's going to wrap it up for me. Hope these helped you out even just a little bit, because remember, fantasy football is a game of inches, as Al Pacino once told us once upon a time. So again, hope you enjoyed. Make sure you guys check out fantasylife.com. Free rankings, free newsletter, free everything, because we're just trying to help you guys capture that fantasy playoff championship glory. Appreciate you guys for tuning in. Until next time, take care, everybody.